Eric Arthur Blair, better known as George Orwell, was one of the most influential voices of the 20th century. His works, especially Animal Farm in 1984, stand as powerful warnings about the dangers of unchecked power and control. Orwell didn't have formal training in philosophy, but his writing delves into some of the deepest questions in political thought, ethics, and the role of language. His insights are sharp, layered, and still relevant today. Through his essays, novels, and journalism, he tackled issues like nationalism, propaganda, class struggle, and truth, making him a rare writer who could bridge the worlds of literature and philosophy. In his early work, Orwell examined poverty, labor, and the conditions of the working class. He didn't approach these topics merely as economic issues. For him, they were also social, political, and deeply human concerns. Orwell was among the first to challenge the simplistic, blame-centered explanations of poverty, pushing instead to understand the systems that create and sustain it. The 1930s marked a turning point. Orwell's time reporting on the working class in northern England and his experience fighting as a volunteer in the Spanish Civil War profoundly shaped his political and philosophical beliefs. It was these experiences that led him to declare, in 1946, "Every line of serious work I have written since 1936 has been, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." For Orwell, totalitarianism wasn't just a government structure. It was an unyielding pursuit of power and control over every aspect of life. He saw that totalitarian regimes didn't only seek to control the body, but also the mind. This is at the heart of 1984, where Winston Smith, the protagonist, declares, "Freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows." Orwell's point here is subtle, yet profound. Freedom depends on the ability to hold true beliefs and to express them. In Orwell's view, thought and language are inextricably linked to freedom itself. If a regime can control what people think and how they communicate, it can achieve absolute power. In his writing, Orwell saw language as both a means of expression and a means of control. He anticipated how deeply language could be twisted for political ends. This is why, in Orwell's eyes, totalitarian regimes target language itself. They twist it, limit it, leaving people fewer ways to articulate their thoughts and resist oppression. Through Orwell's work, we see a rare combination of political insight, philosophical depth, and storytelling prowess. His ideas on power, truth, and freedom resonate across time, reminding us of the crucial need to protect the integrity of language and the mind. Eric Arthur Blair, known to the world as George Orwell, was born on June 25, 1903, in India. His father, an Englishman, worked in colonial India for the British Imperial Services, overseeing the production of opium for export to China. When Blair was less than a year old, his mother, of English and French descent, brought him and his older sister back to England. Growing up, he saw relatively little of his father, who remained in India until he was 8. Blair often described his family as part of England's lower upper middle class. This complex social status would profoundly shape his perspective, embedding in him a strong sense of class consciousness, a theme that reappears throughout his work, especially in his autobiographical essay, "Such Were the Joys." There, he reflects on his experiences at St. Cyprian's, the English preparatory school he attended from ages 8 to 13 on a merit-based scholarship. At 13, Blair went on to Eton, one of England's most prestigious schools, again on scholarship. Yet despite the advantages, he didn't thrive academically, and eventually chose a path outside higher education. Like his father, he joined the specialized services of the British Empire, and in 1922, he was stationed in Burma, what we now know as Myanmar. There, he spent 5 discontented years with the Imperial Police, before leaving the position in 1927 to return to England in pursuit of a writing career. Needing to support himself, Blair endured years of hardship and near poverty, living in both Paris and London. These experiences would form the basis for his first book, Down and Out in Paris and London, published in 1933. It was with this book that Blair introduced the world to his pen name, George Orwell, the name he would keep for all his future works. Orwell's personal experiences inspired much of his writing. His years in Burma became the foundation for his second book, Burmese Days, published in 1934, as well as his well-known essays, A Hanging and Shooting an Elephant. For his third novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, published in 1935, Orwell drew on his experiences as a hop picker and a schoolteacher, and in 1936 he published Keep the Aspidistra Flying, a novel about a man who abandons his middle-class job for the meager pay of a bookseller, hoping to make it as a writer. Notably, Orwell wrote this book while he himself was working as a bookseller. The years 1936 and 1937 were transformative. Encouraged by his publisher, the socialist Victor Gollancz, Orwell traveled to the industrial north of England to document the harsh living and working conditions. The resulting work, The Road to Wigan Pier, was published in 1937. The first half details the poverty he witnessed. The second half is an appeal for socialism and a critique of the British left for failing to reach the working class. Published as part of Gollantz's Left Book Club, Wigan Pier gained significant attention, reaching a broader audience than Orwell's previous books. In 1936, Orwell married Eileen O'Shaughnessy, an Oxford-educated woman with a degree in English who had worked as a teacher and secretary. Shortly after, he volunteered to fight in the Spanish Civil War, joining the Republican side against Franco's nationalist forces. His wife, Eileen, joined him in Spain soon after. Orwell's experiences in Spain solidified his political convictions, and he witnessed firsthand the conflicts within the political left. Fighting with the POUM, a Marxist militia later branded by Soviet propaganda as a haven for Trotskyists, Orwell saw the effects of ideological manipulation and became wary of the totalitarian tendencies within leftist factions. These experiences would later form the basis of his 1938 work, Homage to Catalonia. Homage to Catalonia not only marked Orwell's commitment to political themes, but also highlighted a deepening focus on language and truth. In Spain, he saw how language could be twisted, how narratives could be controlled, and how these manipulations shape power structures, a concept that would resonate throughout his later works. Returning to England, Orwell faced recurring health issues from a gunshot wound he'd received in Spain, but his pace as a writer was relentless. In 1939, he published Coming Up for Air, and in 1940, Inside the Whale and Other Essays, followed in 1941 by his seminal essay, The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. Though he wanted to serve in World War II, his health kept him from enlisting. Instead, Orwell joined the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, where he worked from 1941 to 1943, producing radio content to support the Allied effort aimed at the Indian subcontinent. However, with few listeners and high censorship, Orwell came to see the role as a waste of his time. This experience would later inspire the Ministry of Truth in 1984. After leaving the BBC, Orwell joined the democratic socialist magazine Tribune as a literary editor and began writing his popular column, As I Please. In 1944, he and Eileen adopted a baby boy named Richard. That same year, Orwell finished his breakthrough work, Animal Farm. Due to its anti-communist message, he struggled to find a publisher, as Britain was allied with the USSR, but it was eventually published in August 1945. A few months after Eileen's sudden death during surgery, Animal Farm brought Orwell both fame and financial success, allowing him to move with his sister and young son to the isolated island of Jura in Scotland. Here, amidst declining health and without electricity, Orwell worked on what would become his final masterpiece, 1984. Published in 1949, 1984 was the culmination of Orwell's life's work, touching on nearly every theme he had explored: poverty, social class, war, nationalism, truth, censorship, propaganda, and language. Orwell passed away less than a year after 1984's publication. In his final days, he married Sonia Brownell, who would later work tirelessly to preserve and promote his legacy. Her efforts included co-editing a 4-volume collection of his essays, journalism, and letters, published in 1968. This compilation deepened the public's fascination with Orwell's work, interest that remains as strong today as ever. Orwell once wrote, "Every line of serious work I have written since 1936 has been, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." This declaration reflects a dividing line in his work, pre-1936 and everything that came after. In the years after 1936, Orwell's writing became intensely political. He was focused on the interconnectedness of language, thought, and power. In his earlier years, however, Orwell's themes were different. Pre-1936, his work centers on two sets of interwoven ideas: poverty, money, work, and social status on one hand, and imperialism with its ethical consequences on the other. One of Orwell's consistent topics was poverty. It's at the heart of books like Down and Out in Paris and London and The Road to Wigan Pier, as well as in many of his essays, The Spike and How the Poor Die, to name a few. When Orwell wrote about poverty, he didn't aim to be an impartial observer. Instead, he spoke as a member of the middle class addressing fellow readers from the middle and upper classes. He wanted to dismantle the myths and misconceptions about poverty that many in his audience held. Orwell's portrayal of poverty isn't about grand tragedy. Rather, he describes the subtle, almost dull despair that poverty can bring. In Down and Out in Paris and London, he writes, "It is altogether curious, your first contact with poverty. You have thought so much about poverty. It is the thing you have feared all your life, and it is all so utterly and prosaically different. You thought it would be quite simple. It is extraordinarily complicated. You thought it would be terrible. It is merely squalid and boring." Orwell often wrote from the perspective of someone who, like himself, encountered poverty later in life rather than being born into it. He believed that for those who come down into poverty, there could even be a strange sense of relief. Once you've fallen, he suggests, the fear of poverty fades. There's almost a pleasure in knowing yourself at last genuinely down and out. But Orwell had a different kind of pity for those born into poverty, observing that they confront it with what he called a blank, resourceless mind. This reflection reveals Orwell's complicated class biases, which he was never entirely able to shed. A major goal in Orwell's discussions on poverty was to humanize the poor. He rejected the notion that there was a fundamental difference in character between rich and poor. Rather, it was their circumstances that differed. Orwell saw a peculiar sense of the sinfulness of poverty ingrained in English society. By sharing his experiences, he hoped to dissolve this belief, arguing that, in essence, the mass of the rich and the poor are differentiated by their incomes and nothing else. Orwell firmly believed that systemic issues, not personal failings, were to blame for poverty. If society wrongly associates poverty with vice, Orwell argues, then it equally mistakenly links money with virtue. He examines this theme in Keep the Aspidistra Flying, a novel that follows a man who tries and fails to escape the grip of money. Here, Orwell suggests that money's significance goes beyond the economic, it's also social. In Wigan Pier, he describes England's social structure as a money stratification that operates almost like a shadowy caste system. These reflections on money and class strongly influenced Orwell's support for socialism. In The Lion and the Unicorn, he argues that true social unity could only be achieved by minimizing income disparities. He writes, "A man with $3 a week and a man with $1,500 a year can feel themselves fellow creatures, but this isn't possible between the richest and the poorest in society." Orwell was also deeply interested in how money shapes work, and how work, in turn, affects human experience. In Keep the Aspidistra Flying, the protagonist Gordon Comstock leaves a steady job to pursue his dream of writing, only to discover that poverty drains his motivation. For Orwell, meaningful work requires a certain level of financial comfort. He remarks in Wigan Pier, "You can't command the spirit of hope in which anything has got to be created, with that dull, evil cloud of unemployment hanging over you." Orwell believed that the inability to engage in satisfying work was one of poverty's most damaging effects. Work, to Orwell, was a vital part of human existence, a way to engage both body and mind. He once wrote that human beings need work, and that cutting people off from it was, in essence, cutting them off from life itself. But Orwell did not idealize work. He was critical of work that degraded the individual, or jobs that were both tedious and exploitative. He reserved particular disdain for the harsh working conditions faced by low-level staff in Paris restaurants and coal miners in northern England. He recognized that people tolerated these conditions out of sheer necessity, even though they robbed individuals of what he saw as essential to a fulfilling life. By the time he left Burma at the age of 24, George Orwell had developed a profound opposition to imperialism. His anti-imperialist views are powerfully expressed in works like Burmese Days, his essays Shooting an Elephant and A Hanging, and in The Road to Wigan Pier, where he reflects I hated the imperialism I was serving with a bitterness which I probably cannot make clear. Staying true to his tendency to write from lived experience, Orwell often focused on the damage he saw imperialism inflict on the imperialist oppressor, rather than directly addressing its effects on the oppressed. This focus could be seen as a limitation, but it also reflects Orwell's aim to reveal the true costs of imperialism to his primary audience, who were, after all, largely beneficiaries of the British Empire. When Orwell describes imperialist oppression from the perspective of the oppressor, he often returns to several core themes. The first of these themes is experience. Orwell argues that one cannot truly despise imperialism without being part of it. He suggests that first-hand experience in the machinery of despotism reveals its tyranny in a way that nothing else can. One is, as Orwell puts it, part of the actual machinery of despotism. This experience leads to the second theme, guilt and moral damage. After working with the British Imperial Police in Burma, Orwell describes feeling a profound weight of guilt, a burden he struggled to expiate. He writes, "If you do for 5 years a job that you thoroughly disapprove of, you will probably feel the same." He developed a simple, if mistaken, theory that the oppressed are always right and the oppressors are always wrong. Though he later recognized this as an oversimplification, it was, as he put it, a natural result of being one of the oppressors yourself. The third theme Orwell explores is a paradox within imperialism, that even though the imperialists hold economic and political power over the oppressed, they too become controlled, often by those they dominate. In his essay, Shooting an Elephant, Orwell tells of killing an elephant in a Burmese village, not because he believed it necessary, but to satisfy the expectations of the local people. Orwell writes, "I perceived in this moment that when the white man turns tyrant, it is his own freedom that he destroys. For it is the condition of his rule that he shall spend his life trying to impress the natives, and so in every crisis he has got to do what the natives expect of him." Orwell's account suggests that under imperialist oppression, no one is truly free, neither the oppressors nor the oppressed. The oppressed experience what Orwell calls double oppression, facing not only the injustices imposed by imperial power, but also the humiliation of foreign domination, and the oppressors, despite feeling guilt and shame, feel compelled to conform to their role, trapped by expectations and unable to act otherwise. Orwell seemed to believe that this was a near universal feeling among British imperialists of his time. Interestingly, some of Orwell's earliest ideas about how pressures to conform socially can suppress freedom of speech emerge in his discussions of imperialism. In Shooting an Elephant, he observes that he had to think out his problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. Similarly, in Wigan Pier, he notes that for British officials in India, there was no freedom of speech. Even being overheard making a single remark critical of the empire could harm one's career. Through these reflections, Orwell reveals the inner conflict of those who serve imperial power. While they may hold dominance over the oppressed, they themselves live under an unspoken code, a code that demands conformity, silence, and complicity. This paradox became a foundation in Orwell's critique of oppressive systems and his lifelong defense of freedom. From the mid-1930s until the end of his life, George Orwell was a committed advocate for socialism, but his vision of socialism was specific, and he worked to defend it against mischaracterization. To understand Orwell's views, it's essential to see both what he believed socialism was and what it was not. Orwell offers a simple yet powerful definition of socialism in The Road to Wigan Pier: justice and liberty. For Orwell, this included not only economic justice but also social and political fairness. His inclusion of liberty reflects his commitment to democratic socialism, a form of socialism that, in his eyes, balances social and economic equality with personal freedoms. He placed particular importance on intellectual freedoms, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, and freedom of the press. In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell lays out his most detailed account of socialism as he envisioned it for Britain. He acknowledges the common definition of socialism as common ownership of the means of production. But he saw this as insufficient. To him, socialism also required political democracy, the removal of hereditary privilege in the House of Lords, and limits on income inequality. One of socialism's greatest benefits, in Orwell's view, was the potential to eliminate class-based prejudice, a prejudice he saw as a major barrier to building unity and connection within society. Given his experiences in England's socially stratified culture, he saw the dismantling of both economic and social inequality as essential for creating a society that was both just and free. In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell proposed specific changes that England could adopt in light of World War II to become, as he put it, a socialist democracy. These proposals included nationalization of land, mines, railways, banks, and major industries, limitations on income inequality, so that the highest tax-free income wouldn't exceed the lowest by more than a 10-to-1 ratio, reform of the educational system, along democratic principles, immediate dominion status for India, with the option to secede after the war, formation of an imperial general council, with representation for colonized peoples, a formal alliance with China, Abyssinia, and other nations victimized by fascist powers. Orwell believed these steps could transform England into a model of socialist democracy. In the latter half of Wigan Pier, Orwell addresses why many people were resistant to socialism. He argues that socialism is often associated with ideas and behaviors that aren't actually intrinsic to it. For instance, he believed that socialism did not require blind promotion of technological progress, nor did it reject local loyalties, patriotism, or individuality. He viewed socialism as fundamentally different from both Marxism and communism, regarding the latter as a form of totalitarianism, wearing a socialist mask. In The Lion and the Unicorn, Orwell contrasts socialism with capitalism, which he defines as an economic system in which land, factories, mines, and transport are owned privately and operated solely for profit. His opposition to capitalism is based on his belief that it simply does not work. He suggests that capitalism's forces pull in opposing directions and that individuals' interests often conflict with those of the state. But Orwell's critique of capitalism is also grounded in practical experience. He believed that capitalism left Britain unprepared for World War II and fostered profound social inequalities that eroded the nation's integrity. For Orwell, socialism represented a hopeful vision for a fairer society, one that combined justice, liberty, and equality in a way that capitalism, as he saw it, never could. George Orwell viewed totalitarianism as a political system driven by an insatiable desire for absolute power and control. In 1984, Orwell brings this concept to life through the character of O'Brien, a high-ranking government official who uses torture and manipulation to dominate the thoughts and actions of the protagonist Winston Smith, an ordinary official in the propaganda-producing Ministry of Truth. O'Brien embodies power as an end in itself, power for power's sake. Orwell recognized that totalitarianism's quest for complete control makes it fundamentally incompatible with the rule of law. In The Lion and the Unicorn, he reflects on the totalitarian idea that there is no such thing as law, there is only power. Where law places limits on a ruler's power, totalitarianism seeks to obliterate those limits entirely. The fair and consistent application of law is, in Orwell's eyes, fundamentally at odds with the complete centralized power that totalitarianism demands. For Orwell, totalitarianism was a distinctly modern phenomenon. He saw Soviet communism, Italian fascism, and German Nazism as among the first political systems to strive for true totalitarianism. In his essay, Literature and Totalitarianism, he describes the unique nature of these regimes. The peculiarity of the totalitarian state is that though it controls thought, it doesn't fix it. It sets up unquestionable dogmas and alters them from day to day. It needs the dogmas because it needs absolute obedience from its subjects, but it can't avoid the changes, which are dictated by the needs of power politics. This relentless pursuit of power drives totalitarian regimes to attempt to reshape reality itself. In such a system, political power is considered more important than objective truth. Yet Orwell also argues that while the belief in truth may be undermined, truth itself remains unbreakable. In looking back on the Spanish War, he writes, "However much you deny the truth goes on existing, as it were, behind your back." For Orwell, this undeniable nature of truth serves as one of two safeguards against totalitarianism. The other safeguard is what he calls the liberal tradition, the classical liberalism that champions individual freedom and limits the power of the state. Orwell understood that totalitarianism could emerge from both the political left and the right, In his view, both Nazism and communism were totalitarian, united by their shared pursuit of total power and their demand for absolute ideological conformity. Orwell knew that achieving such power required extensive surveillance capabilities, hence the prominence of the telescreen and the thought police in 1984. Through these concepts, Orwell warned us that totalitarianism is more than a system of government. It's a mindset that prioritizes power over people, ideology over truth, and conformity over freedom. His work remains a powerful reminder of the vigilance required to protect truth and liberty. One of George Orwell's most influential contributions to political thought is his concept of nationalism. In his essay, Notes on Nationalism, Orwell describes nationalism as the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. In another essay, The Sporting Spirit, he refers to nationalism as the lunatic modern habit of identifying oneself with large power units and seeing everything in terms of competitive prestige. In both descriptions, Orwell emphasizes that nationalism is a habit, a habitual way of thinking. He often calls it a habit of mind, and for Orwell, this habit has two key features. First, it roots one's identity in a group rather than in individual values. Second, it drives a person to place the advancement of that group above all else. For Orwell, nationalism requires that individuals subordinate their personal identity to a larger group, a large power unit, and importantly, Orwell's concept of nationalism isn't limited to nations. He saw nationalism at work in movements as varied as communism, political Catholicism, Zionism, anti-Semitism, Trotskyism, and pacifism. What matters for nationalism in Orwell's view is that individuals adopt the group as their central identity. This can happen in a positive way, as in identifying with a group, but it can also happen through negative attachment, by defining oneself in opposition to a group. This is why, for example, Orwell's list includes both Zionism and anti-Semitism, two directly opposed movements that, nonetheless, share the same nationalistic tendency. However, simply identifying with a group isn't enough for nationalism as Orwell defines it. Nationalists, he argues, make the advancement of their group their top priority. Orwell even states that nationalism is inseparable from the desire for power. In other words, nationalism has an aggressive posture. It seeks to dominate. Orwell contrasts this with patriotism, which he describes as a love of one's own place and way of life, without a desire to impose it on others. For Orwell, patriotism is devotion, a personal loyalty, and a feeling he considers admirable, while nationalism, with its need to assert dominance, is something he considers dangerous. In Notes on Nationalism, Orwell writes that the nationalist is one who thinks solely, or mainly, in terms of competitive prestige. This means that the nationalist's focus is on boosting or denigrating others, on victories and defeats, on triumphs and humiliations. This aspect of Orwell's analysis foreshadows many modern discussions of political tribalism and what we now call negative partisanship, when one's political identity is fueled primarily by a dislike for opposing groups, rather than a commitment to one's own. It's worth noting that Orwell viewed his definition of nationalism as somewhat flexible. He chose the term nationalism to describe a phenomenon he believed was essential to discuss, but his version of nationalism may differ from other definitions. His discussions of nationalism, and the contrast he makes with patriotism, serve as more than mere definitions. They are attempts to reshape our understanding of these ideas, something that today we might call conceptual engineering. Through this exploration of nationalism, Orwell offers a stark warning. For him, nationalism is a force that narrows vision, fuels hostility, and places group power above individual judgment. By understanding this distinction, Orwell hoped his readers would become more aware of how nationalism can distort perspective, and that they might, in turn, recognize the value of a more personal, less aggressive love of one's own place in people. Just as 1936 and 1937 marked a shift toward overtly political themes in George Orwell's writing, they also marked a shift toward epistemology, the study of knowledge, truth, and belief. Orwell became deeply concerned with how powerful entities like governments and wealthy elites could shape and control people's beliefs. Having witnessed the success of propaganda during the Spanish Civil War, he feared that these forces had grown so adept at manipulating beliefs that, in his words, The very concept of objective truth was fading out of the world. Orwell's desire to defend truth, along with his fear that truth itself could be erased in a completely totalitarian society, comes through in 1984, particularly in the reflections of Winston Smith, the novel's protagonist. Truth, belief, evidence, and reliability. Orwell's writing often features terms like truth, belief, knowledge, facts, and evidence, although he rarely defines these terms directly. Instead, he reveals his understanding of these concepts through the way he uses them. Orwell makes a clear distinction between belief and truth, rejecting the notion that group consensus makes something true. In his essay on Rudyard Kipling, for instance, he writes, "I am not saying that that is a true belief, merely that it is a belief which all modern men do actually hold." This statement shows that Orwell saw truth as something distinct from belief, something that does not depend on whether a group agrees with it. For Orwell, truth exists independently of the mind. He writes, "However much you deny the truth goes on existing as it were behind your back." In his view, truth is derived from the way the world actually is. If our beliefs don't align with reality, then our actions will ultimately fail. This is why, Orwell argues, denying objective truth can lead to practical consequences. For instance, you might claim there are enough rations and munitions for your soldiers, but if there aren't, reality will catch up with you, perhaps in the form of military setbacks. For Orwell, this serves as a pragmatic reason to pursue objective truth. Although Orwell doesn't talk about justification for beliefs as an academic philosopher might, he does emphasize evidence and reliability as markers of a belief's validity. In his essay on anti-Semitism, Orwell suggests that if one suspects having anti-Semitic biases, one should start his investigation in the one place where he could get hold of some reliable evidence, that is, in his own mind. Here, Orwell suggests that reliable evidence can sometimes come from introspection, looking inward to uncover the truth. Orwell's writings on the Spanish Civil War offer valuable insight into how he thought we could separate truth from lies. He discusses the importance of testimony as a source of knowledge, writing, "Nor is there much doubt about the long tail of fascist outrages during the last 10 years in Europe. The volume of testimony is enormous, and a respectable proportion of it comes from the German press and radio. These things really happened. That is the thing to keep one's eye on." For Orwell, both the volume and the source of testimony provide strong reasons to believe in the reality of fascist atrocities. Orwell also combines testimony with other forms of evidence, such as first-hand experience. In Homage to Catalonia, he writes, "I have had accounts of the Spanish jails from a number of separate sources, and they agree with one another too well to be disbelieved. Besides, I had a few glimpses into one Spanish jail myself." Here, Orwell shows that consistency among sources, combined with his own experiences, can reinforce the reliability of a claim. Despite recognizing the challenges posed by propaganda, Orwell was not a skeptic about knowledge. He comfortably uses terms like facts and attributes knowledge to those he believes have it, writing, for example, "These facts known to many journalists on the spot went almost unmentioned in the British press." However, he was also aware of our limitations. He noted, "It is difficult to be certain about anything except what you have seen with your own eyes." This suggests that Orwell was a fallibilist, someone who believes it's possible to know something without being absolutely certain of it. Orwell believed that democratic socialism was responsive to political and economic facts, while totalitarianism sought to bend the facts to its will. His commitment to objective truth is therefore closely linked to his promotion of socialism over totalitarianism. This concern for truth led Orwell to confess his fear that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. For him, acknowledging objective truth means accepting reality and the limits it places on us. Reality, as he reminds us, dictates that 2 + 2 = 4, not 2 + 2 = 5. Orwell uses Winston Smith in 1984 to express his ideas about the relationship between truth and freedom. For Orwell, an essential part of freedom is the ability to think and speak the truth. He foresaw the threats to this freedom, not only from nationalism and propaganda, but also from technology that could make constant surveillance possible. Through his writings, Orwell reminds us that the struggle for truth is inseparable from the struggle for freedom, and that recognizing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be, is foundational to preserving our humanity. Writing was one of George Orwell's most powerful tools for dispelling ignorance. In a relatively short career, Orwell produced an impressive range of works: books, book reviews, newspaper editorials, magazine articles, radio broadcasts, and letters. Through his writing, he sought to counter misconceptions. He aimed to correct the ignorance of the wealthy about the poor, to set the record straight on the Spanish Civil War in the face of fascist propaganda, and to clarify the distinctions between democratic socialism and Soviet communism. Orwell's understanding of these issues grew from his own experiences. His initial ignorance had been dispelled not just by reading or research, but by first-hand encounters with poverty, war, and political tension. This belief in the transformative power of experience shaped his writing. He thought that sharing testimony about his own experiences could help others overcome ignorance and see through the fog of misconception. One of Orwell's major concerns was the disconnect between Britain's middle and upper classes and those living in poverty. He felt that those in wealthier circles had only an imagined view of poverty, often an inaccurate one. As he writes in Down and Out in Paris and London, "Everyone who has mixed on equal terms with the poor knows this quite well. But the trouble is that intelligent, cultivated people, the very people who might be expected to have liberal opinions, never do mix with the poor." Orwell addressed these misunderstandings in various settings. He observed that the low-level kitchen jobs in French restaurants, which seemed simple to outsiders, were actually astonishingly hard. He noted that witnessing coal miners at work might cause any English person to question the notion that they were somehow superior, and he warned that working in a bookshop would quickly disabuse anyone of the fantasy that it was a paradise. Yet within Orwell's belief that experience corrects ignorance lies a revealing meta-commentary. Over his lifetime, Orwell amassed a unique set of experiences that gave him insight into the lives of various professions and social classes. This allowed him to empathize with a wide array of white, working-class men. However, there were certain perspectives Orwell could never truly access. Despite his attempts to understand others, he could never fully experience the realities faced by women, people of color, or those who identified as queer. This limitation has led many feminist critics to draw attention to the misogyny and racism present in some of his work. In the eyes of critics like Beddoe, Campbell, and Patai, Orwell's writings reflect biases against women, as well as racist views, particularly toward people of color. His work often also shows signs of homophobia, as in Keep the Aspidistra Flying. Additionally, critics have identified instances of anti-Semitism and anti-Catholic sentiment in his writings. These critiques point to a critical insight about Orwell's work. While he recognized the power of experience to dispel ignorance, his own experiences were limited by the social context of his time, his prejudices, and perhaps by the constraints of his imagination. For all Orwell's insights, these limitations remind us of the importance of diverse perspectives and of the need to question even the voices we most admire. Orwell's writing aligns closely with philosophical ideas that emphasize embodied cognition, the idea that our thoughts and beliefs are deeply influenced by our physical experiences. Unlike the philosopher Descartes, who described humans as primarily thinking beings, Orwell had a more grounded view. As he put it, "A human being is primarily a bag for putting food into. The other functions and faculties may be more godlike, but in point of time they come afterwards." This connection between physical conditions and human thought runs through all of Orwell's nonfiction works, as well as Animal Farm and 1984. In Homage to Catalonia, he describes how, as a soldier in the Spanish Republican Army, a lack of sleep made him feel very stupid. In Down and Out in Paris and London, he shows how a poor diet can make it so that one can interest oneself in nothing, reducing a person to little more than a belly with a few accessory organs. And in The Road to Wigan Pier, he argues that even the best intellect cannot withstand the debilitating effect of unemployment. Though the unemployed may have time, Orwell believed that to write or create they also need peace of mind, a peace of mind that their living conditions could not provide. Orwell's emphasis on embodied cognition also illustrates the link he saw between the political and the epistemic, between the state of the body and the state of the mind. In Animal Farm, for instance, the animals are driven to rebellion after they are left unfed. Their physical hunger compels them to act. Later, Napoleon, the dictatorial pig who takes control of the farm, ensures that the animals are kept overworked and underfed. By keeping them physically exhausted and hungry, he makes them easier to control. Similarly, in 1984, while food is strictly rationed, gin is plentiful for party members. Orwell shows how physical conditions, hunger, comfort, and even substances like gin, affect the mind's ability to resist. And when Winston Smith, the novel's protagonist, is subjected to torture, we see how physical pain breaks his will until his thoughts become completely malleable, shaped to fit the party's agenda. For Orwell, embodied cognition reveals a dangerous cycle in totalitarian regimes. Controlling the physical conditions of the citizenry strengthens the party's control over their minds, and this control over their minds helps the party maintain control over their bodies. Through his stories, Orwell warns that physical deprivation can not only weaken the body, but also bend the mind, making freedom impossible when the basic needs of life go unmet. Orwell saw memory as both flawed and invaluable. Despite its weaknesses, he believed memory is often our best or even our only way to access certain truths about the past. As he puts it, treacherous though memory is, it seems to me the chief means we have of discovering how a child's mind works. Only by resurrecting our own memories can we realize how incredibly distorted is the child's vision of the world. In his essay, My Country, Right or Left, Orwell shares his wariness about the unreliability of memory, yet he also expresses optimism that with concentration and reflection, we can separate true memories from false impressions. He argued that over time, the British memory of World War I had become colored by nostalgia and distorted narratives. He urged readers to disentangle your real memories from later accretions, suggesting he believed this separation was possible. Later, he claimed he was able to honestly sort out my memories and disregard what I have learned since about World War I. These reflections show Orwell's understanding of memory's political significance. Accurate memories, he believed, have the power to challenge lies, including lies about history, but memory's vulnerability to distortion also makes it a target for manipulation by those in power. Orwell feared that totalitarian governments were promoting a deep skepticism about the possibility of recording true history. At the same time, these governments used propaganda to push their own versions of history, versions that often contradicted facts entirely. This complex relationship between truth, memory, and history is a central theme in 1984. The protagonist, Winston, resists the party's lies by clinging to memories that contradict the party's false claims. But the antagonist, O'Brien, seeks to erase Winston's faith in his own memories, pushing him toward a complete rejection of objective truth. Orwell's reflections on truth, memory, and history under totalitarianism are echoed throughout his work. Essays like Looking Back on the Spanish War, Notes on Nationalism, and The Prevention of Literature show that Orwell viewed memory not just as a personal faculty, but as a political one that can either empower individuals or become a tool for control. Through Winston's struggle in 1984, Orwell warns us of the consequences when those in power rewrite history. In a world where memory and truth are fragile, Orwell reminds us that protecting them is vital for both individual freedom and the integrity of history itself. Orwell's fascination with language was broad, encompassing everything from the joy of mere words to the profound political potential of language as a tool to push the world in a certain direction. He believed that language could either clarify or obscure meaning, and he sought to reveal its political significance. Language and thought. For Orwell, language and thought are deeply intertwined, each influencing the other. He viewed thought as shaped by language, which itself is shaped by thought. In his essay, Politics and the English Language, Orwell examines this relationship directly. He focuses on how language can degrade thought and vice versa, writing that English becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish. But the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. He adds, if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. Yet Orwell's purpose in this essay is ultimately hopeful. He believed that this cycle of corruption could be reversed. The process, he writes, is reversible. Orwell felt that the poor habits of thought and writing he observed could be avoided with enough effort. His essay serves, in part, as a guide for doing just that. Orwell sees this relationship between thought and language as part of a broader, three-way connection between language, thought, and politics. Just as thought and language influence each other, so do thought and politics. In Orwell's view, good writing leads to clear thinking, and to think clearly is a necessary first step toward political regeneration. This makes good writing a political task, Orwell concludes that for English-speaking political communities, the fight against bad English is not frivolous and is not the exclusive concern of professional writers. He even speculates that under dictatorship, languages like German, Russian, and Italian had deteriorated due to political control over thought and speech. Orwell's goal wasn't to defend standard English or rigid grammar rules. Instead, he wanted language users to let the meaning choose the word and not the other way about. Clear communication, he argued, requires conscious thought and effort. Choosing words that genuinely convey one's meaning takes work, while using cliched phrases or well-worn metaphors can obscure meaning from others and even from oneself. He describes a person so taken over by stock phrases, stale metaphors, and orthodox language that they have gone some distance toward turning themselves into a machine. The appropriate noises are coming out of their larynx, but their brain is not involved, as it would be if they were choosing their words for themselves. Orwell explores this idea further in 1984 through the concept of duckspeak, a term used to describe those who merely quack like ducks, mindlessly repeating orthodox slogans and party lines. Orwell reminds us that language is not merely a tool for expression. It shapes how we think, understand, and act in the world. Through careful language use, Orwell believed we could work toward clearer thinking and, ultimately, toward a healthier political environment where truth and meaning aren't lost to empty words. Like many of the terms central to his thought, Orwell never clearly defined propaganda, and he may not have always used it consistently. Still, he was an insightful commentator on how propaganda works and why understanding it matters. Orwell often used the term propaganda in a negative sense, but this doesn't mean he saw all propaganda as inherently harmful. In fact, he once wrote that all art is propaganda, while also denying that all propaganda is art. For Orwell, propaganda's primary purpose is to influence contemporary opinion. This suggests that Orwell saw propaganda as any messaging aimed at shaping public opinion. And for him, it wasn't limited to words. He frequently pointed out the propagandistic impact of images and posters, likely inspiring his depiction of the omnipresent Big Brother posters in 1984. Orwell's view of propaganda differs from more restrictive definitions that require it to be misleading or manipulative. To him, propaganda is simply a message intended to persuade, regardless of its content. Orwell found much of the propaganda of his time deeply troubling, especially because of its harmful effects on individuals and society. Propaganda, he believed, operates by controlling narratives and ultimately influencing thought. One tactic he noticed was how propaganda often manipulates language to shape its effect on audiences. For example, Orwell observed that dictators like Hitler and Stalin would commit atrocities without ever calling them murder, instead opting for terms like liquidation, elimination, or some other soothing phrase. At other times, however, propaganda consisted of blatant lies. In a description reminiscent of the world he created in 1984, he wrote, "Much of the propagandist writing of our time amounts to plain forgery. Material facts are suppressed, dates altered, quotations removed from their context and doctored so as to change their meaning." Orwell also recognized that poorly executed propaganda could not only fail, but even backfire, pushing audiences away rather than persuading them. He was particularly critical of propaganda from the political left that he felt alienated working-class people. Orwell believed that effective communication was essential to any cause, and he expected the same care and honesty from his allies as he did from his opponents. In his analysis of propaganda, Orwell sought to expose the subtle ways in which it can shape beliefs, control narratives, and distort reality. Through his warnings, he challenges us to recognize propaganda's impact on our perceptions and to question the messages we encounter every day. Orwell saw aesthetic value as distinct from other forms of value, like moral or economic value. He often discussed aesthetic value in the context of literature, which he considered a category of art. However, he didn't believe literature should only be judged on its aesthetic merits. For Orwell, literature, and art in general, could be assessed morally and politically as well. This view aligns with his desire to make political writing into an art. Value of art and literature. Orwell's belief that aesthetic value is separate from moral value is clear. In an essay on Salvador Dali, he famously noted that one ought to be able to hold in one's head simultaneously the two facts that Dali is a good draftsman and a disgusting human being. But when it comes to defining aesthetic value, Orwell seems to hold two conflicting views. Sometimes he suggests that aesthetic values are objective, yet difficult to fully explain. At other times, he appears to view them as rooted in individual taste. For instance, Orwell once wrote that his own time was an age in which the average human being in the highly civilized countries is aesthetically inferior to the lowest savage. This implies that there is a standard for aesthetic refinement that transcends cultural differences. He even suggested that one's cultural environment can shape or corrupt one's aesthetic sensitivity, arguing that the ugliness of his society had spiritual and economic causes, and that aesthetic judgments, especially literary judgments, are often corrupted in the same way as political ones. Orwell also believed some people simply have no aesthetic feelings whatever, a trait he thought was particularly common in England. On the other hand, he wrote that, ultimately, there is no test of literary merit except survival, which is itself an index to majority opinion. This implies that aesthetic value may ultimately rest in shared intersubjective experiences rather than any objective standard. One way to reconcile these views is to consider the different methods Orwell saw for assessing literary merit. He suggests that if there is such a thing as good or bad art, then the goodness or badness must reside in the work of art itself, not independently of the observer indeed, but independently of the mood of the observer. In this sense, a poem cannot be good on Monday and bad on Tuesday. However, if the poem is judged based on the enjoyment it produces, then its value may indeed vary, since enjoyment is subjective. This distinction implies that literary merit can be assessed either by its inherent qualities or by the subjective pleasure it brings, and these two approaches need not always align. Still, the question remains, what justifies artistic merit? In his essay on Charles Dickens, Orwell suggests that, as a rule, an aesthetic preference is either something inexplicable or it is so corrupted by non-aesthetic motives as to make one wonder whether the whole of literary criticism is not a huge network of humbug. This suggests that Orwell saw aesthetic value as ultimately ineffable, something that may not be fully explainable. Yet despite this, he believed that art could still be evaluated on aesthetic, moral, and political grounds. Orwell's reflections on art and literature remind us of the complexity of aesthetic judgment. For him, art's value is both distinct and multifaceted, touching not only on what we see and hear, but on how it challenges us to think and engage with the world. Orwell believed that there was no such thing as genuinely non-political literature. For him, all literature carried a political message, even if that message was as simple as reinforcing the status quo. This is part of what Orwell meant when he said that all art is propaganda. To him, all literature, like all art, seeks to influence public opinion. For this reason, he saw all literature as inherently political. Because literature is political, Orwell argued that a work's political stance often shapes how much merit a reader assigns to it. He observed that people tend to view literature that aligns with their beliefs more favorably, while dismissing works that challenge their views. He captured this idea by noting the extreme difficulty of seeing any literary merit in a book that seriously damages your deepest beliefs. But while literature could influence politics through its message, Orwell also saw politics as influencing literature. He argued that fiction is often censored in the interests of the ruling class. This, for Orwell, was troubling enough in any society, but it was especially dangerous in a totalitarian regime. He believed that true literature could not survive under authoritarianism, as there is no intellectual freedom and no stable set of shared facts. Orwell wrote that the destruction of intellectual liberty cripples the journalist, the sociological writer, the historian, the novelist, the critic, and the poet in that order. Orwell's views reveal a complex interplay between politics, thought, language, and art. In his view, certain political orders make literature impossible, while literature, in turn, has the power to shape politics and public thought. For Orwell, literature isn't just about expression. It's a fundamental force with the power to defend or dismantle the freedom to think. Orwell's relationship to academic philosophy has always been complex. Though he admired Bertrand Russell, he once remarked that struggling through one of Russell's books made him feel that philosophy should be forbidden by law. Orwell counted A.J. Ayer as a great friend, but Ayer himself noted that Orwell wasn't interested in academic philosophy in the very least, and probably considered it rather a waste of time, and he dismissed Jean-Paul Sartre as a bag of wind, to whom he was ready to give a good boot. Some have concluded that Orwell was either uninterested in or simply unsuited for rigorous philosophical work. Bernard Crick, one of Orwell's biographers and himself a philosopher, argued that Orwell would have been incapable of writing a contemporary philosophical monograph, noting that Orwell chose to write in the form of a novel, not in the form of a philosophical tractatus. This may well be true, but it does not mean that Orwell's work was uninfluenced by philosophy, nor does it mean his work lacks value for academic philosophers. Orwell rarely referenced philosophers by name in his writing, aside from occasional critiques of Marx. This makes it challenging to gauge his familiarity with certain thinkers. Crick believed Orwell had not read J.S. Mill or Karl Popper, though he seemed to reach similar conclusions independently. Yet while there's little evidence of Orwell's engagement with the broader history of philosophy, he was certainly familiar with some philosophical work written during his lifetime. He reviewed books by both Sartre and Russell, and his personal library contained several of Russell's books. Peter Bryan Barry has argued that Russell likely influenced Orwell's views on topics like moral psychology, metaethics, and metaphysics, and many scholars note that Orwell's writing grapples with philosophical themes, even if he didn't approach them as an academic philosopher would. These observations can be reconciled by distinguishing between being an academic philosopher and being a philosophical thinker in a broader sense. As Barry puts it, Orwell's lack of interest in academic philosophy is consistent with his great interest in normative public philosophy, including social and political philosophy. David Dwan makes a similar point, preferring to call Orwell a political thinker rather than a political philosopher, and noting that we can map the challenges Orwell, presents for political philosophy without ascribing to him a rigor to which he never aspired. Through his novels and essays, Orwell engaged with some of philosophy's most pressing questions, often in accessible, everyday language. His relationship to academic philosophy may have been distant, but his work remains a valuable resource for philosophical inquiry. Orwell's work has had a profound impact on philosophers across multiple fields, from political philosophy to philosophy of language, epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics. One notable example is Richard Rorty, who devoted a chapter to Orwell in his 1989 book, Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity. Rorty argued that Orwell's description of our political situation, of the dangers and options at hand, remains as useful as any we possess. For Rorty, part of Orwell's value lay in how he sensitized his readers to a set of excuses for cruelty, helping reshape our political understanding. Rorty saw Orwell's work as revealing the possibility of totalitarian figures like 1984's O'Brien, a character who embodies the terrifying reality of political cruelty. But perhaps the greatest value Rorty found in Orwell's work was the way it emphasized the deep human value of being able to speak one's beliefs and to talk to other people about what seems true to you. For Rorty, Orwell exemplifies the importance of intellectual freedom. However, Rorty interpreted Orwell in a way that some have found controversial. He suggested that Orwell valued intellectual freedom but was not concerned with truth itself. According to Rorty, it does not matter whether 2 + 2 is 4 is true, and claimed that Orwell's question about the possibility of truth is a red herring. This interpretation has sparked a debate among philosophers, as it downplays Orwell's concern with truth itself. In response, several philosophers have defended the view that Orwell did in fact care deeply about truth, and considered it to be real and objective. For example, Peter van Inwagen, David Dwan, and James Conant have all argued that Orwell's work does engage with the concept of objective truth, refuting Rorty's interpretation. Orwell's influence extends well beyond his own era. His writings have continued to inspire discussions among philosophers about the nature of truth, the importance of intellectual freedom, and the dangers of totalitarianism. By examining Orwell's work, philosophers grapple with some of the deepest issues surrounding freedom, power, and the role of truth in human life. In philosophy of language, Derek Ball identifies George Orwell as someone who recognized the political implications of linguistic facts, noting that a particular metasemantic fact might have certain social and political consequences. Ball also suggests that Orwell, on one interpretation, appears to accept both linguistic determinism and linguistic relativism. Linguistic determinism is the claim that one's language influences or determines what one believes. to the extent that speakers of different languages may develop different and even incompatible beliefs because they speak different languages. Linguistic relativism, meanwhile, is the claim that one's language influences or determines what concepts one possesses, and hence what thoughts one is capable of entertaining, leading speakers of different languages to have distinct conceptual repertoires. These insights frame some of Orwell's key philosophical commitments about language, thought, and politics. Ball's observations align with Judith Shklar's view that 1984 is not really just about totalitarianism, but rather about the practical implications of the notion that language structures all our knowledge of the phenomenal world. Similarly, Justin D'Ambrosio, in his work on manipulative speech, highlights Orwell's relevance to politically charged philosophy of language, a field that's now growing in academic philosophy. As seen in the work of Kuh and Sturken, Orwell's influence extends into epistemology as well. Martin Tyrrell argues that much of Orwell's later work attempts to address the political consequences of fundamentally philosophical questions, such as, when and what should we doubt, and when and what should we believe? Simon Blackburn also emphasizes the significance of Orwell's worries about truth for political epistemology, observing that the answer to Orwell's worry about the possibility of truth is not to give up inquiry, but to conduct it with even more care, diligence, and imagination. Additionally, Mark Satta highlights Orwell's recognition of the epistemic point that our physical embodied conditions influence our thoughts and beliefs. Orwell's views have also been valuable to moral philosophy. He saw moral value as distinct from aesthetic or other types of value, and academic philosophers have examined his views on ethics closely. Barry argues that Orwell's moral perspective aligns with threshold deontology, where certain moral norms such as truth-telling should generally be followed, but can be overridden to prevent horrendous consequences. Barry also suggests that Orwell's moral norms stem from his humanist account of moral goodness, which bases ethical principles on what is fundamentally beneficial for human beings. David Dwan supports this interpretation, noting that while Orwell criticized moral consequentialism, he wasn't an absolute opponent of it. Dwan points out that Orwell accepted the necessity of some forms of violence in war, indicating a nuanced view that balances deontological principles with pragmatic considerations. Orwell's legacy in academic philosophy spans multiple fields, offering valuable perspectives on language, truth, ethics, and the human condition. His writings continue to inform philosophical inquiry, challenging readers to consider the deep connections between language, thought, and the ethical frameworks that shape our lives. Philosophers have also explored Orwell's writing at the crossroads of ethics and political philosophy. For example, Martha Nussbaum highlights the ethical and political significance Orwell places on emotions in 1984. She examines how Winston Smith yearns for a world that allows free expression of emotions like love, compassion, pity, and fellow feeling, while O'Brien aims to create a world dominated by fear, rage, triumph, and self-abasement. Oriol Quintana has explored the importance of human recognition in Orwell's work, using it to develop an account of the ethics of solidarity. Quintana also identifies parallels between Orwell and the French philosopher Simone Weil, especially in the value they both place on rootedness, a feeling of belonging in the world, in contrast to detachment or asceticism. Felicia Nimue Ackerman has emphasized that 1984 is, at its core, a novel about a love affair. She argues that it raises questions about the nature of human agency and relationships under extreme political oppression. Meanwhile, David Dwan has examined Orwell's understanding of key moral and political terms like equality, liberty, and justice. Dwan describes Orwell as a great political educator, but less for the solutions he proffered than for the problems he embodied and the questions he allows us to ask. Although Orwell was never a professional philosopher or an academic, he offers much to those interested in philosophy. His insights have become increasingly valued by philosophers in recent years. Despite being limited by his era and personal biases, Orwell was a sharp critic of totalitarianism and other abuses of political power. He understood the deep connections between political life and other dimensions of human experience, such as what we believe, how we communicate, and what we hold dear. Through his fiction and essays, Orwell challenges us to reflect on the interwoven aspects of individual and political life, making his work a valuable resource for anyone interested in human experience and the complexities of political power. Thanks for tuning in to Bytes. We hope you enjoyed diving into the fascinating life and ideas of George Orwell. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations of influential thinkers, their stories, and the ideas that shaped our world. And hit the bell icon so you never miss an update. There's plenty more to come. From groundbreaking philosophers to revolutionary scientists, Bytes is your go-to spot for bite-sized biographies that leave a big impact. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay curious.